The main focus of this presentation will be about the U.S. and some of their dealings in Latin America following the Spanish-American War. And so by this time, it was pretty obvious that we were hoping to extend and make larger our power and our influence. And what we were looking at is how can we extend it? How can we become more powerful in Latin America? Latin America is basically Mexico, South America, Central America, the Caribbean. Anything directly below the United States of America is Latin America. And so, one of the big issues that they had in being able to have power in that area is that it was really kind of hard to move around the United States, especially for our Navy. At one point in the Spanish-American War, we needed an extra battleship over there to fight against the Spanish, and they sent the battleship Oregon around from California to Cuba. Well, the only way you could possibly do that was to go all the way around the bottom of South America and then come all the way back up. And it took more than 2 months to get that ship to Cuba. It's like 14,000 miles. And so they realized in order to really be more powerful, we need to make some sort of connection where our ships can move a little bit quicker and we can have some influence in that. And so, realizing we needed a shorter route, the president at the time, Theodore Roosevelt, he had a plan. And his plan was to build a canal. Okay, and this canal was going to be built across Central America, but he had to find the perfect spot. And he found it right here at the Isthmus of Panama, the narrowest spot of them all. It was only 50 miles wide, the thinnest area. However, Colombia owned the land at that time. So what we did is we offered to rent it. We said we'll pay you $10 million up front, and then we'll give you $250,000 a year, and we get control over this 6-mile piece of land. Well, Colombia didn't like that. They didn't like the idea of the U.S. having control, and so what they did is they held out for more money. And so President Roosevelt was kind of getting a little bit impatient. So instead, he told the people of Panama that we would support them if they wanted to fight against Colombia to get their independence. So, of course, the people of Panama, who had been taken over previously by the Colombians, were all for this independence, and they knew that if they had America on their side, they could easily beat the Colombians, and so they decided to go for their independence on November 3rd, 1903. Now, there were United States gunboats in the harbor in Panama, ready to fight in case Colombia sent any ships or anybody close to the water. And then there were Marines that were landed right on the isthmus, right down towards the bottom, to block any Colombian troops, any backup land troops, from joining in the fight. And so very quickly the war was over and the Panamanians gained their independence from Colombia. So now, since we wanted to rent it from Colombia, but since they didn't do it, Roosevelt kind of went behind their back and got the Panamanians to get independence so we could rent it from them. And so immediately the United States, within 3 days, recognized Panama as a country and said, yep, you're a free country, you're your own. And then put a Frenchman in charge of Panama, and then they rented the land from Panama. And so they rented, instead of a 6-mile wide zone, they rented a 10-mile wide zone, and they paid $10 million, which is what they offered before, and $250,000 a year forever. And so they paid exactly the same amount for a larger piece of land from Panama. However, there was an issue. In the area, they knew there were these diseases, yellow fever and malaria, and they were killing a lot of people. They were a huge problem. And so we realized that we couldn't start actually building this thing and be safe until we figured out what was causing this yellow fever and malaria. A lot of experts thought different things, maybe that it was the damp, cool night air was causing it. They just didn't know why it was happening. Until William C. Gorgas, a doctor at the time, found out that it was carried by mosquitoes. And so when he found out that yellow fever and malaria was carried by mosquitoes, they knew they could do something about it. And so they went through and they cleared all the brush, so bushes and trees and all that kind of stuff from the area, and the swamps, and they drained some of the swamps, and they basically wiped out where the the mosquitoes could breed and lay their eggs and stuff like that. And so they got rid of most of the mosquitoes and eliminated the disease among the workers. And so that was, William C. Gorgas is one of the main reasons that we were able to be successful in starting to build the Panama Canal. And there were three really huge tasks when it came to building the Panama Canal that were going to be difficult. Obviously, cutting through land and making your own river is going to be hard no matter what. But if you have to cut through and dig a mountain through a mountain, that's going to be the hardest one. And so 9 miles of this area that they selected to go through was right straight through a mountain, and so they had to cut through it, and that was called the Galliard Cut. And it was, like I said, a 9-mile long thing, and it just seemed like they were moving rocks forever. Blow up the rocks, move them out of the way, blow up the rocks, move them out of the way, constantly moving rocks, and exhausted. And almost all of the work, a lot of the time, was spent in this one 9-mile area of the 50 that they did. And there was a terrible amount of sun and heat, and then if it was raining, there were mudslides. It was just a horrible experience for those workers. And so other major tasks, they had to dam a river, they had to stop a river, and you can see the dam right here on the Panama Canal. So they had to build this dam. And then they also had to build locks, and locks are like a water elevator that help you cross the mountains. And so they kind of, I'll show you exactly how they work, but they kind of, as you go in it, the water fills up, and then you move up and you can go out the other end. Or you go in it, the water drains out, and then you can go down the other end. And so instead of going over a waterfall, which is impossible for the ships, they can kind of step down a little bit at a time. And so that helped them to cross these different elevations and move up the mountains and then back down to the ocean. And so the workers who were working out there were two different types. The engineers, the people in charge of it, were Americans, so they were white. But most of the workers that were actually there were Africans, and these Africans were from these close islands like Barbados, for example. Barbados had 20,000 workers that were part of this workforce that made the Panama Canal, that were hired by the Americans. Building the Panama Canal was not only difficult work, but also pretty dangerous work. About 6,000 workers died in their attempts to work on and finish the Panama Canal. However, it went pretty well, honestly, outside of the lives lost, and so they finished 6 months early, 6 months ahead of the schedule that they had hoped, and it took about 10 years to make it. They finished on August 15th of 1914, and the total cost was $387 million. This bottom part right here is, you can go to that phschool.com and type that in if you want to, but we will look at it in class as well. So the next thing we're going to look at is three different types of diplomacy that some presidents were choosing to do, how to deal with other countries, hopefully without war. And the first one we're going to talk about is Theodore Roosevelt's diplomacy, which was called Big Stick Diplomacy. And Big Stick Diplomacy, for President Roosevelt, the 26th president of the U.S., he believed in an African proverb that said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick, you will go far." And so basically that's just saying you need to be nice, you need to speak softly, you don't need to threaten anybody, but if you're always carrying around this baseball bat, then people know that you mean business. And if they won't pay attention to you, then you can use that to hit them. And so the big stick diplomacy is, you have to try diplomacy first. You have to try everything else first before you attack. But if it fails, we can use our huge military to back up our threats, and we will eventually actually attack. So part of his big stick diplomacy was to create the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. A corollary is an addition, you add it on. And so he extended the Monroe Doctrine, and he was trying to keep Europe from becoming too powerful in any of the places that are close to the U.S. And the Roosevelt Corollary said, when there are problems in Latin America with foreign nations, with other countries, we can act to restore order. And so basically making us the policemen of all of Latin America, which sometimes some of them may want that help and some may not want that help, but we even still to this day use it to make it okay for us to get involved in the problems of Latin America. William Howard Taft decided that dollar diplomacy was the better move and the better type of diplomacy. And so, as the 27th president, he started to use this. And dollar diplomacy, it's pretty simple. It just means that if we get involved economically, that's the best way to get more power in a place. If we put money into a place, that's the best way to get more power, because we'll be having all the jobs for them. We'll do all that kind of stuff. And so he told the people, if we want power in Latin America and we want power in Asia, you need to start investing and building companies in there. With money comes power in a region. So dollar diplomacy, the problem is if you've got people and companies in that region, if something bad happens, you do have to send your military. And so when the investments are threatened, you have to go into conflict. So dollar diplomacy didn't work any better than big stick diplomacy. There was still the issues of, or about the same amount of issues of conflict and fighting. Woodrow Wilson, the 28th president, his main goal was to try to nurture and build democracy. He wanted to support democracy all around the world. And so he had, during his presidency, there were some problems with Mexico. Mexico was in this violent revolution. In the year 1911, people were trying to overthrow the government. And so some U.S. sailors landed in Mexico on the coast, and when they went in, they were arrested for a little bit of time. But as soon as they were arrested, the Mexican government kind of figured it out and released them right away. Okay, and so the United States, to pay Mexico back for arresting their men, their soldiers, attacked the city of Veracruz and ended up killing about 100 Mexicans. So it was very close to another Mexican-American war. And then some South American countries arranged peace talks between Mexico and the U.S., and they agreed that they wouldn't fight. Then they got close to war again, because this man down in the corner, bottom right corner, Pancho Villa, his real first name was Francisco, he came across the border. He was one of the rebels down there, and he came across the border into New Mexico, and he raided a town and ended up killing 18 people within that town. We were mad, so we were going to chase him down no matter what, but Mexico said, okay, we don't want to fight against you, America, so we're going to let you bring your military in to chase him around, but once you capture him, you need to leave. And so Mexico actually let us chase him across the border. We never did capture him. We sent General John J. Pershing, and eventually bigger concerns came up, which we're going to talk about in the next two slideshows, and those concerns were a world war happening.